These weren't glittering cities. They were muddy, desperate outposts, populated by men who had nothing to lose but the few brittle sticks of firewood warming their miserable taverns. But these men possessed one thing the crowned heads of Europe lacked: an absolute, blinding, maniacal hunger for profit that defied God, man, and nature itself.
They looked out at the churning, gray tempest and saw not certain death, but the shimmering, silver mountains of cash hidden within the seasonal migration of the herring. That fish was the medieval oil, the liquid gold of the north, and whoever controlled its distribution controlled the destiny of Europe.
The stakes were so high, the risk so paralyzing, that failure didn't mean bankruptcy. It meant the long, slow, agonizing death by frostbite, or worse, a quick, brutal execution at the hands of the sea wolves, the pirates who ruled those dark waters with axes and iron fists.
This was a catastrophe no one saw coming, the birth of the Hanseatic League. It was not founded by decree, but born out of pure, unadulterated terror and necessity. Every voyage was a gamble where the house always won, and the house was the North Sea itself.
Picture the docks of Lübeck on a raw December morning. The air is so cold, it feels like shards of glass entering your lungs. The merchant, draped in thick, ill-fitting furs, knows that if his single cogship doesn't make it to Bergen or Bruges, his entire lineage faces ruin. He knows that lurking just beyond the sight lines of the Coast Guard, if such a rudimentary force even exists, are the monstrous ships of the dreaded Vitalian brooder, pirates who would rather sink a vessel for sport than take its cargo for profit. The world was utterly lawless, a true Wild West of the waves, and the established rulers offered no protection whatsoever. The local dukes were too weak, the Holy Roman Emperor too distant, and the powerful Scandinavian kings viewed these upstart German towns with barely concealed contempt and simmering jealousy. They saw them as temporary fleas that could be crushed whenever it suited royal convenience. But the merchants, these pragmatic, hard-eyed survivors, understood a fundamental truth that changed everything. Individually, they were nothing. Together, they could be an empire made of timber, rope, and ledger books. This initial, tentative idea that sharing risk and pooling resources was the only path to survival was the quiet explosion that triggered the greatest economic revolution of the Middle Ages. They realized that a coordinated network of trade settlements, bound by shared legal codes and mutual defense, could effectively nullify the power of kings and the terror of the sea. It was an act of breathtaking, audacious brilliance, rooted in the deepest human desperation. Imagine the scene. Two men, perhaps in a smoky tavern in Hamburg, sharing cheap ale and swapping horror stories of lost ships, realizing that their mutual hatred of the cold, the pirates, and the tax-hungry nobility was stronger than any national loyalty. They decided, in that moment, to forge a secret, ironclad pact.
This wasn't a treaty signed with fanfare. It was a desperate handshake sealed by the promise of overwhelming retaliatory violence if one of them were harmed. Their alliance was an economic weapon of mass destruction, capable of starving entire cities or flooding markets with enough goods to collapse local economies overnight. They didn't need armies. Their currency was control over supply, and their weapon was the swift, brutal boycott. But before they could even consider challenging the Danish crown or crushing the pirates, they had to survive the constant, insidious threat of the environment itself. The cogs, their robust, purpose-built cargo ships, were technological marvels, but one unexpected gale could shatter them against the rocky shores, sending centuries of wealth to the bottom of the icy abyss. Every nail driven, every sail hoisted, was a silent prayer against the monstrous power of Boreas, the north wind. They built their harbors deep and strong, designed their houses with narrow gables to minimize wind resistance, and lived their lives with a ruthless efficiency born from the knowledge that nature would grant them no grace. This initial stage, the founding era around 1250, was defined by this terrifying balance: the relentless pressure of the cold, the ever-present shadow of the pirate fleet, and the intoxicating, unimaginable promise of the wealth that lay just beyond the horizon. It was a race against time and ice, where the losers were simply erased from history. And the most shocking twist of all, this massive shadow empire of commerce, this league that would one day dictate terms to kings, started with nothing more than 2 small towns and a desperate whispered oath to protect the flow of fish and fur from the dark north. This is where the true saga begins, in the freezing, gold-drenched darkness. The cold air swallowed the oath, but the promise was heavier than any church bell. It demanded immediate, impossible action. 2 fragile coastal settlements, Lübeck built on its island fortress, and the gritty outpost of Hamburg, staring down the treacherous Elbe, were now bound by fate, and far more terrifyingly, by profit. They didn't just merge their ledgers, they forged a single, unstoppable will against a chaotic world that wanted them dead and stripped bare. What treasure justified this madness? It wasn't gold dug from the earth or diamonds torn from distant mines. It was silvery, slippery life pulled from the darkest depths. The herring. Every year, millions upon millions migrated through the narrow straits between Denmark and Sweden, creating an unimaginable, ephemeral river of wealth. The sheer scale of the Skåne market was a spectacle of biblical proportions, a place where fortunes were made and lost in the space of a single tide, drawing every scoundrel, noble, and starving peasant within a 1,000-mile radius. This fish was the currency of survival for all of Christian Europe, especially during the long, agonizing months of religious fasting mandated by the Church. Without the Hansa to secure the salt, transport the barrels, and battle the elements and the legions of cutthroats drawn by the scent of riches, half the continent would starve or break their solemn vows. The Hanseatic merchants were not just fulfilling a need. They were guaranteeing the moral and physical survival of Europe, and they knew exactly how much that was worth.
But the herring was useless without the white gold, salt. This wasn't some minor seasoning. It was the ultimate tool of preservation, the magical agent that turned perishable life into eternal wealth, mined far inland in the fabled depths of Lunenburg. The Hansa had to establish ironclad control over the entire supply chain, from the deep salt pans to the fishing boats bobbing dangerously near the treacherous Jutland coast, and then across the brutal, storm-torn seas to the waiting stomachs of London and Bruges. This meant controlling the roads, muddy tracks infested by petty robber barons and local gangs who saw the merchant caravans as mobile treasuries ripe for the taking. Every sack of salt carried the weight of a dozen desperate battles, fought not with swords, but with carefully negotiated tolls, bribes, and the brutal threat of coordinated economic boycotts. The price of one barrel of salted herring contained centuries of logistics and the latent threat of total financial war. And the danger wasn't just external. The greatest friction wasn't the freezing spray or the hidden rocks. It was the institutionalized greed of the established power structure. Every local duke, every territorial bishop looked upon the burgeoning, untaxable wealth of these upstart burghers with burning envy and suspicion. They demanded crippling tariffs, arbitrary seizures, and the right to dictate trade routes, attempting to clip the wings of the soaring mercantile machine before it left the ground, desperate to reclaim their feudal authority. Lübeck and Hamburg responded with a terrifying, unprecedented weapon: unity. If a duke in Mecklenburg dared to seize a single barrel of Lunenburg salt or detain a single Hanseatic cog, the entire network would immediately shut down his ports, starve his people of essential grain, and watch his meager localized economy collapse into chaos within weeks. No single local lord, no matter how armored, could withstand this economic tsunami. The power of the collective ledger was far stronger than the strength of any castle wall. The initial spark quickly became a wildfire, consuming the entire Baltic coast. To truly dominate the north, they needed to conquer the east, where endless, dark forests held unimaginable riches. Thick Russian firs, vital timber for shipbuilding, and the mysterious, prized Baltic amber, the fossilized sun that captivated the Mediterranean. They turned their attention to the great island of Gotland, home to the legendary trading hub of Visby. Visby was a glorious, chaotic, multi-ethnic jewel, a pirate's dream, a city dripping in silver and gold, built upon centuries of brutal trade with Novgorod and the deep Russian interior. But Visby was too fractured, too independent, too prone to internal feuds and foreign interference from Danish and Swedish kings. Lübeck, with its superior municipal organization and absolute discipline, saw not a rival, but a weakness to be exploited and ultimately absorbed. They didn't just want a port. They wanted the keys to the entire Baltic Sea. Lübeck, strategically positioned at the head of the Trave River, became the undisputed nerve center, the mother city of the entire Hansa, the Königin der Hansa. Its council wasn't made up of inherited nobles or warrior class. It was a ruthless oligarchy of calculating merchants whose financial decisions were thicker and more binding than any royal decree from the Holy Roman Emperor, who often ignored them anyway.
These merchant lords standardized currency, mandated rigid shipping regulations, and established a common legal code, the Lubisches Recht, that became the foundation of order, commerce, and merciless stability across hundreds of miles of lawless, freezing coastline. This legal code wasn't born from democratic ideals. It was about protecting capital, guaranteeing contracts, and prosecuting piracy with extreme prejudice. If you were a Hanseatic merchant, you were protected by the most formidable economic and legal shield the North had ever known. If you were a pirate, a rival, or a princeling who dared obstruct the flow of goods, that same code was a death sentence delivered swiftly and absolutely, often without the tiresome inconvenience of a royal trial. They were not merely traders. They were nation builders operating outside the concept of a nation-state, a phantom empire powered by the cold, undeniable, organized hunger for profit. They were learning the critical lesson. In the brutal, dark North Sea, survival meant not just cooperation, but total, unified, and terrifying control. The nascent Hanseatic Agreement, forged in the frozen sweat of desperation and the shared terror of a Viking raid, was already demanding a terrifying evolution. Informal pacts were good for a single voyage, a shared watch against the rising tide of brigands. But to truly dominate the world, they needed something harder than ice, something more unyielding than the iron of their ship fittings. They needed law.
This was the moment the Hansa stopped being a club of cold-weather traders and became the world's first true corporate empire, a shadow state built entirely on ledger books, salted fish, and the merciless enforcement of their own terrible code. The challenge was unprecedented. How do you govern a sprawling network of towns separated by hundreds of leagues of savage, pirate-infested water and resentful royal territories without a single king, a standing army, or even a centralized capital? Their answer was ruthless and brilliantly efficient: the contours.
These were not just trading posts. These were fortified economic embassies, self-governing islands of Hanseatic law dropped deep into hostile foreign lands. Imagine stepping off the muddy, chaotic docks of 13th century London and finding the Stahlhof, the Steely Yard, a perfectly ordered, terrifyingly clean German city within a city, surrounded by high walls, defended by its own guards, and subject to no man's law but their own. In Bruges, the nerve center of textile exchange, they dictated prices with an invisible hand of iron. In Bergen, Norway, they controlled the stockfish monopoly, turning dried cod into staggering fortunes. But the most crucial, the most legendary, the most utterly brutal contour of all was Peterhof, planted like a defiant sword in the chaotic, dangerous heart of Russia.
Novgorod. Novgorod was the gateway to the east, the source of the furs, sable, ermine, fox, that clothed the aristocracy of Europe, and the wax necessary for every single church candle across the continent. This was where the true, vast, unbelievable wealth lay. But to get it, the Hansa merchants lived under near-siege conditions, barred from interacting with the local populace outside of strict, terrifyingly regulated business hours. They were locked into their fortress at night, their lives depending on the absolute loyalty of their brethren and the strength of their walls. A single rogue merchant, a single deviation from the Hanseatic code could mean not just ruin, but a swift, brutal execution by the enraged Russian princes who hated their economic chokehold.
The Hanse's genius was that they understood that power wasn't solely about territory, it was about indispensable commodities. And in 1250 CE, the single most indispensable commodity in all of Europe wasn't gold, wasn't silver, it was protein. It was the salted herring, the silver of the sea, the mandatory sustenance for a continent observing hundreds of days of mandatory Catholic fasting. Every Friday, every Lent, every feast day requiring abstinence from meat, the entire economy hinged on that small silver fish.
And the Hansa cornered the source. Off the shores of Scania, where the Baltic Sea narrowed, the herring migration was so thick, so astronomically massive, that fishermen could practically scoop them from the water with baskets. It was a seasonal, chaotic, brutal gold rush, attracting every profiteer, every criminal, and every desperate peasant in Northern Europe. The Hansa didn't just fish there, they owned the salt, they owned the barrels, they owned the process. They established massive temporary cities, known as the Schonenmärkte, solely dedicated to salting and barrel packing the harvest. They brought in hundreds of tons of salt from Lüneburg, transforming the chaotic Scania coast into the most important economic hub on Earth for 3 months of the year.
The stench of brine and fish guts was overwhelming. The work was backbreaking, but the profit margins were so staggering they beggar belief. Every barrel of Hansa-branded herring was a guaranteed sale, a certified quality product that could feed armies and sustain entire cities through the long winter.
If a local king dared to raise a tariff, or a local pirate dared to touch a Hanseatic cog, the response was immediate, terrifying, and total. They didn't declare war with swords, they declared war with silence. The Hansa would simply stop trading. No timber for ships, no grain for bread, no salt for preservation, no furs for warmth. Entire cities, even kingdoms, would suddenly find their economies grinding to a catastrophic halt, their harbors empty, their citizens starving. This was the infamous Hansa embargo, a weapon far more devastating than any cannon, deployed with cold, surgical precision. The lesson was learned swiftly and brutally across the northern kingdoms. You do not, under any circumstances, anger the merchants of the North Sea.
They demanded absolute loyalty, not just from the founding cities, Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, but from every town that wanted a share of the unimaginable herring wealth. The agreements were codified, the rules were set in stone. Trade only with Hansa members, adhere strictly to quality controls, and above all, unite against all others. Their power was not derived from noble birth or divine right. It was derived from the brutal, cold, undeniable, organized hunger for profit. They were learning the critical lesson. In the brutal, dark North Sea, survival meant not just cooperation, but total, unified, and terrifying control, enforced by economic annihilation. The age of the merchant king had begun, hidden in plain sight behind a wall of salted fish and foreign fortifications. The contours stood as silent, imposing monoliths, monuments to the fact that money, organized correctly, could conquer the world more effectively than any crusader or emperor. And inside their walls, the ledgers grew heavy with the promise of absolute dominion. The ledgers were finished, bound in heavy leather, their pages filled not with ink, but with the chilling arithmetic of conquest. The merchants of Lübeck, the hardliners of Hamburg, and the desperate souls of Visby realized that holding the power was nothing if they didn't project it. The local docks were too small for their ambition, the local waters too safe for their greed. They needed to plant their flags, not physical banners, but ruthless bureaucratic outposts in the very heart of their enemies' lands, creating islands of absolute Teutonic efficiency, surrounded by seas of chaos and envy. This was the birth of the contour, the trading factory, the fortress of finance. It was an idea so audacious, so utterly cold-blooded, that it should have failed immediately. Yet, it became the steel spine of the rising Hanseatic League. It was here, miles from home, that the young, unmarried factors, the dedicated soldiers of the ledger, lived lives of monastic devotion to profit, sworn off local vices, dedicated only to the sacred flow of cod, salt, and furs. 4 such fortresses stood out, the undisputed pillars upon which the entire economic world of the North would soon rest. Bergen, the gateway to the Norwegian cod mountains. Bruges, the velvet epicenter of Flemish textile wealth. London, the unpredictable port across the stormy channel. And the most terrifying of all, Novgorod, deep in the frozen wilds of the Rus. Imagine the Peterhof in Novgorod, a wooden cage in the midst of a hostile, snow-swept land, surrounded by suspicious princes and vast, empty forests, teeming with wolves and bandits. The factors stationed there were men who knew they might never see the Baltic Sea again, sealed off for months by the merciless winter. Their wealth was incomprehensible. Mountains of Siberian squirrel and ermine pelts, beeswax and honey. But their existence was a cold, constant vigil against sudden slaughter. Their only protection the formidable reputation of the Hansa's swift and ruinous retribution. Any attack on the Peterhof
was considered an act of war against every single town from Rostock to Riga. A lesson learned quickly and violently by any local prince foolish enough to attempt expropriation.
Contrast this brutal isolation with Bruges, the jewel box of the West. Here, the challenge was not survival against the elements, but survival against staggering, tempting luxury. The Hanseatic contour in Bruges was a monument to order amidst a bustling metropolis of silks and spices.
Yet the Flemish merchants, masters of their own destiny, resented the German intrusion, their strict rules, and their absolute refusal to pay local tariffs they deemed unfair. The Hansa factors lived under rules more stringent than any monastery. No socializing with local women, no gambling, no consumption of expensive wines. Every penny was accounted for, every minute dedicated to maximizing the terrifying velocity of capital. They were economic automatons, designed purely for the cold extraction of value. This required a relentless standardization that was utterly foreign to the fragmented, feudal medieval world. To move vast quantities of salt from Lüneburg to Bergen, and then furs from Novgorod to Bruges, the Hansa had to invent logistics on a continental scale. They decreed unified weights and measures across hundreds of miles and dozens of competing dialects. If you bought a barrel of brine-cured herring in Lübeck, you knew precisely what size and quality you would receive, guaranteed by the infamous Hanseatic seal, a mark of quality that became the most respected and most feared brand in the known world, often more reliable than the coinage of kings. This standardization extended to the sea itself. As the wealth accumulated, so did the target painted on their backs. The Northern Sea, already a savage opponent of wind and ice, now swarmed with pirates, the dreaded Vitalian brooder, and rogue nobility preying on the unprotected wealth streaming from the east. Individual ships were easy prey, but the Hansa did not sail alone. They created the convoy system, the Kogengemeinschaft, a fleet of the mighty rounded cogs sailing together, bristling with rudimentary cannons and armed guards, often escorted by dedicated warships paid for entirely by the merchants themselves. This was organized self-defense on a scale no royal navy outside of perhaps England had yet mastered. When a king demanded exorbitant tolls, the Hansa didn't waste time in tedious negotiation. They immediately embargoed. They simply pulled all their ships out of the offending port, shutting down entire economies overnight by starving them of essential goods. The economic pain was immediate, brutal, and undeniable. Kings might command armies, but the Hanseatic League commanded the very air kings breathed, the very salt that preserved their meat, and the very grain that fed their people. They had weaponized scarcity, turning their ledgers into instruments of siege warfare. This economic warfare solidified their internal bond. The individual towns might squabble over market shares or local precedents, but facing an external threat, be it a Danish privateer or an angry Swedish bishop. They closed ranks with the terrifying speed of a well-drilled phalanx, unified by the shared fear of losing their commercial advantage. The ultimate power lay not in the contour or the ships, but in the collective commitment to the common ledger. The fate of a lonely factor freezing in Novgorod was intrinsically tied to the market price of salt cod in London. The system was now self-sustaining, a financial machine demanding ultimate sacrifice and promising unimaginable riches. The only thing left to conquer was the North Sea itself, the most unpredictable, savage partner in their deadly enterprise.
The greatest enemy was not the King of England or the greedy Archbishop of Bremen. The greatest enemy was the water itself, a relentless, freezing liquid beast waiting to swallow their fortunes whole, ready to shatter.
They needed a vessel capable of surviving the worst temper tantrums the North Atlantic could throw at them. Something more than the slender, beautiful Viking longships of old. Vessels only suitable for coastal raiding and fast retreat. The necessity of bulk trade demanded a revolution in naval architecture, a rejection of elegance in favor of brute, uncompromising strength. The answer was the kage, the cog. If the Venetian galley was a sleek, aristocratic dagger slicing through the Mediterranean, the Hanseatic cog was a heavy, square-rigged hammer, blunt and terrifyingly effective, built to absorb punishment and carry mountains of wealth. It was not built for speed. It was built for survival. A floating wall of oak, designed primarily to carry staggering amounts of bulk cargo, salted herring, heavy Baltic timber, and iron. These ships were bathtub-shaped monsters, their massive single mast topped with a square sail, slow but immensely stable in the monstrous choppy waves of the German Bight, riding high over the peaks others dared not approach. The deep, powerful stern-mounted rudder, a relatively new innovation that replaced the inefficient steering oars of older vessels, allowed a single strong steersman to keep the ship pointed directly into the oncoming mountain of water, preventing the catastrophic broadside that meant instant sinking. Every inch of the cog was a compromise between physics and greed. Its flat bottom allowed it to beach easily on the shallow, shifting sands of Frisia and Flanders, vital for loading and unloading in undeveloped ports, where proper jetties were a distant, costly dream. But that same shallow draft made it roll violently in heavy seas, turning the voyage into a grueling, stomach-churning pest of endurance for the crew, who often suffered more from the motion sickness than from the sheer cold. They didn't just sail a North Sea, they endured it. Every single journey, a desperate, agonizing battle against kinetic forces. Survival required more than just wood and canvas, however. It required law. When a ship sinks, who bears the loss? When a captain jettisons valuable cargo to save the hull from capsizing, is he a desperate hero or a thieving fool exploiting a crisis? These questions, simple yet capable of collapsing entire financial empires and inciting town-wide feuds, demanded resolution that transcended the petty jurisdiction of local dukes. The merchants of the nascent Hansa understood that their power structure had to be invisible, codified, and absolute, enforced not by armies, but by the threat of total economic ruin.
They began formalizing the rules of engagement, drawing heavily upon the older, established codes of trade, refining them into what would become the legendary Seerechte, the sea laws of Visby and Lübeck. These weren't just lists of penalties for theft. They were the constitution of a sea-born republic, laying the foundation for modern commercial liability. The laws defined the exact percentage of loss a merchant must bear versus the ship's owner, standardized weights and measures across a dozen different language regions, from the Estonian port of Reval to the English port of Boston, ensuring that trade was seamless and trustworthy. Most crucially, the sea laws established a shared, brutal military obligation. If a Hansa ship was attacked by pirates, or worse, by a territorial king's privateers masquerading as simple raiders, every other Hansa ship nearby was legally and morally bound to assist, under penalty of immediate and total exclusion from the League, a sentence worse than death.
This wasn't mere friendship. This was calculated, enforced solidarity, creating a mutual defense pact that functioned without a standing navy or a single king. Insurance, though still primitive, began to emerge from this framework. Shared risks managed through sophisticated pooling of capital and the distribution of bottomry bonds.
If a merchant lost a shipment of salt from Lüneburg, the pain was spread thinly across dozens of financiers in dozens of cities, ensuring that no single catastrophic loss could shatter the fragile web of their confederation, making the whole greater than the sum of its sinking parts. But even the strongest laws and the sturdiest cogs faced the ultimate human threat. The North Sea was not just cold, it was infested with predators. The moment a cog, heavy with Baltic gold, in the form of wax, furs, and copper, left the safety of the Skagerrak, it became a moving target for the filthiest predators in Europe.
Piracy was not the exception. It was a standard economic model for desperate coastal dwellers, ruined knights, and kings too bankrupt to fund their courts legitimately, who happily sold letters of marque to anyone with a fast ship and a hungry crew. The threat was ever present, sometimes personified by powerful groups like the later Vitalienbrüder, the Victual Brothers. But even now, petty lords controlled strategic choke points like the belt crossings, demanding crippling tolls or simply taking what they wanted under the guise of customs duties. To sail the North Sea was to navigate a corridor lined with teeth, where survival depended entirely on the armed readiness of the crew. Therefore, the Hansa had to arm its trade. Every single cog became a potential warship, not for elegance, but for pure, terrifying defense. High castles were built at the stern and bow, platforms for crossbowmen and men-at-arms, turning the lumbering freighter into a floating, spiky hedge of resistance.
The crew of a Hanseatic trader was not composed of simple sailors. They were trained fighters, ready with grappling hooks, boiling pitch, and the sheer ferocity born of defending life-altering fortunes. A merchant who survived 10 voyages was not just a successful businessman. He was a hardened veteran, capable of commanding a boarding action in the middle of a gale. They were traders first, but they were soldiers by necessity, defending millions of florins against the eternal hunger of the poor and the grasping ambition of territorial rulers who sought to siphon off their profits.
Lübeck, the acknowledged queen of the Hansa, began funding escort missions, requiring smaller towns to contribute men and arms to protect the massive convoys that moved between Novgorod and Bruges, creating a rudimentary yet terrifyingly effective merchant navy.
This was the first terrifying shadow of a unified military force, a league of merchants capable of raising an armed fleet bigger than most royal navies of the time, dedicated not to conquest, but to the cold, hard-edged defense of pure profit.
The unified force the Hanseatic merchants had forged was not theoretical. It was an iron fist wrapped in silk, designed for one purpose: protecting the unimaginable wealth flowing from the darkest, coldest corners of the known world. The moment the Hansa declared its existence and its monopoly, the pirates of the Baltic and the North Sea didn't laugh. They sharpened their rusty blades.
To them, this was not a trading coalition. This was a concentrated, floating vault waiting to be plundered. Every slow-moving vessel laden with Icelandic cod or priceless Russian sable furs, a grand prize demanding immediate slaughter. The Hansa knew that the very concept of international waters was a joke written by historians centuries too late. In 1250 CE, every wave was an invitation to bloodshed, and every sudden fogbank concealed a hidden, desperate, and hungry enemy. Usually desperate men thrown off land by famine or feudal cruelty, now masters of sudden violence upon the waves. The survival of the entire league hinged on their ability to neutralize this relentless, omnipresent threat of maritime anarchy.
Their answer to the swirling terror of the raiders was not speed, which was impossible in the choppy northern waters, but brute strength, terrifying defensive capacity, and sheer, uncompromising tonnage. This was the triumphant era of the Hanseatic cog, a lumbering, flat-bottomed war horse of the waves, designed by pragmatic North German engineers who valued cold stability over any fleeting notion of elegance or speed. These cogs were floating forts, characterized by their towering fore and aft castles, designed not just for storage, but as elevated firing platforms to rain arrows and stones down upon smaller, faster boarding vessels. High sides, a single towering square-rigged mast, and a cavernous, deep belly for maximizing cargo. It looked less like a graceful ship and more like a massive, floating bathtub reinforced with strategically placed iron bands, utterly impervious to swift attack. But these were the castles of the sea, impervious to the smaller, swifter Viking-style vessels still plaguing the coasts.
the very ships that terrorized local fishermen. The cog could carry enough ballast, enough dedicated armed men who looked far more like mercenaries than deckhands, and crucially, enough projectile weapons to turn a routine trading venture into a slow-motion, devastating naval engagement that few pirates dared to initiate.
This magnificent, if ungainly, vessel was the unquestioned backbone of Hanse's defensive and economic might. An unsung industrial hero built entirely for the bottom line, designed to withstand the rage of the northern sea and the rapacity of man. Defense, however, meant unity in action, true, ruthless, coordinated unity. No longer would a merchant from the fledgling port of Rostock or the rising powerhouse of Lübeck dared to sail alone, exposed and vulnerable to the slightest attack. The Hansa instituted a severe, uncompromising system of synchronized sailing, known simply as the convoy, enforced by fear of expulsion from the League's protection. Imagine dozens upon dozens of these massive, square-rigged cogs carrying enough salt, textiles, wine, and wax to power half of Europe's luxury and industry, gathering in the icy, critical harbors of Visby or Bergen. They waited, sometimes for weeks, for the pre-arranged signal, the collective, disciplined heartbeat of commerce demanding protection, moving only when the entire, terrifying formation was complete and ready. They moved as a monstrous, unstoppable floating block, slower than any single predatory raider, yes, but virtually impenetrable to all but the largest royal fleets. If one ship was sighted or threatened by the sight of black sails on the horizon, the surrounding 4 or 5 ships would immediately pivot their massive hulls, transforming the peaceful trading fleet into a terrifying impromptu battle formation, surrounding and crushing the aggressors. This level of unified power required strategic, militarized operational hubs, nodes of absolute Hansa law carved out of foreign soil, often against the express wishes of local lords. These were the legendary contours, not mere flimsy warehouses, but heavily fortified extraterritorial compounds located in strategic choke points like London, Bruges, Bergen, and the distant, frozen Russian outpost of Novgorod. In London, the area known as the Steel Yard, or Stahlhof, was a defiant little slice of German sovereignty, a fortress of timber and stone where English kings, however proud and demanding, dared not tread, because the Hansa controlled the flow of crucial raw materials. Inside the contours, the rules were famously brutal, rigorously disciplined, and focused solely on the sacred preservation and maximization of profit, with zero tolerance for internal dissent or external interference. Any Hansa merchant, regardless of his town's political standing, caught breaking the League's immutable commercial laws, whether through reckless price gouging, unauthorized smuggling, or, worst of all, displaying cowardice in the face of pirate attack, faced instant ruin. Their goods would be seized, their assets forfeited, and they would be instantly banished forever into the unforgiving, unprotected world outside the League's cold, hard-edged protective fold. This was emphatically not a democracy. This was a ruthless commercial dictatorship,
a cold-blooded oligarchy enforced by stern, heavily armed guards and watchmen who often looked much more like career-hired mercenaries than quiet bookkeepers or humble traders. The defense was so fierce, the organization so absolute, because the prize that drove them was so absolutely staggering, so impossible to imagine. Forget the fleeting lure of exotic Asian gold and silks. The true, monumental fuel for this burgeoning empire was cold, slimy, silvery fish. The annual herring migrations off the coast of Scania, then Danish territory, were an annual biological miracle, a predictable, reliable tidal wave of protein and wealth that fundamentally shaped the geopolitical map of Northern Europe for centuries. When the herring ran in the Sound, thousands of boats descended upon the area, turning the sea into a moving city of desperation and greed. The Hanseatic towns, particularly those focused on the crucial salt trade necessary for preservation, gained a suffocating stranglehold on this resource, controlling the supply chain from net to final consumer. This wasn't merely fishing or resource extraction. This was the manufacturing of caloric survival for Catholic Europe, perpetually hungry and desperately reliant on meatless Friday meals and Lenten restrictions. Controlling the herring meant controlling the diet, and thus controlling the wealth and internal structure of the entire continent, a power far greater than any king's army. The sheer volume of wealth generated from salted herring and the necessary industrial-scale salt supply from the Lüneburg salt works provided the staggering, necessary capital required to fund their unified war chest. The same chest used to hire the heavy guard details, build the armored cogs, and, increasingly, to buy the loyalty of powerful nobles and the neutrality of petty princes. Kings watched this brazen, undeniable rise of merchant power with venomous envy. Chief among them was the King of Denmark, whose kingdom straddled the very geographic throat of the entire Baltic Sea, the Sound, the only viable gateway to the profitable North Sea. They viewed the Hanse's economic control over Scania and the herring markets not just as an economic threat, but as an existential, national insult. A nation ruled not by blood, lineage, or divine right, but by common tradesmen and their ledger books. Unthinkable. But the moment Denmark tried to assert its ancient royal right to heavily tax, plunder, or simply seize the Hanse fleets passing through their waters, they met a unified wall of cold, organized resistance, unlike anything that weak royal house had faced before. This was not a soft negotiation or a polite request for lower tolls. This was a swift, crushing declaration of commercial warfare that leveraged the geography of their power. The Hanse didn't send nervous diplomats with sealed letters. They sent massive, blockading fleets of armored cogs, ready to shut down the Danish kingdom's access to the vital North Sea trade entirely, effectively strangling their already shaky economy in a matter of crushing weeks. The ruthless merchants had calculated the exact tipping point, where the economic pain they could immediately inflict exceeded any temporary military glory or territorial gain a king might seek. The balance of power in the north was violently shifting from the medieval castle to the disciplined counting house, enforced not by ancient chivalry, but by cold, hard steel and the terrifying, unprecedented efficiency of unified profit motive. The terrifying efficiency wasn't just hidden away in the ledger books of the secretive council. It was floating on the churning, merciless waves of the Baltic. If the Hanseatic League was an iron fist raised against the medieval world, the cog, the Hansa cog, was the terrifying, blunt hammer it swung with devastating force. These legendary vessels were not the flimsy, open Viking longships of old, nor the shallow-drafted hulks favored by Mediterranean traders struggling with coastal traffic. The cog was a purpose-built weapon of commerce, designed specifically to withstand the brutal freeze, the crushing ice packs, and the sudden murderous gales of the northern sea, environments that swallowed lesser ships whole and without warning. Its massive, rounded hull, often protected by thick planks and sealed with tar against the ceaseless damp, offered an unprecedented cargo capacity, allowing a single voyage to move what previously required a dozen smaller vessels. This astonishing technological leap forward instantly slashed the operational costs to almost unbelievable lows, while simultaneously multiplying the potential profits into astronomical, kingdom-challenging figures. The cog was the physical manifestation of their new, cold religion: volume, velocity, and absolute, crushing monopoly, proving that engineering could conquer the natural world better than any nobleman's army. But technology alone does not conquer an empire. Control over essential, life-sustaining resources does. And the Hansa didn't just trade goods, they traded necessity, the very key to European survival. Their true black gold wasn't glittering Prussian amber or exotic Russian furs. It was the endless, pulsating shoals of North Sea herring, caught in such overwhelming abundance that entire coastal economies were instantly remade just to process this silver harvest into edible wealth. The Hansa secured a terrifying monopoly over this essential mineral, specifically the high-quality salt imported through critical channels they controlled, notably the vast saltworks of Lüneburg and the distant ports of the Bay of Biscay. This control over salt meant they literally held the key to the survival of millions of people far inland, who depended entirely on salted fish to survive the long, desolate, cropless winters when fresh food was only a dream. A king could starve his people by forbidding the shipment of grain, but the Hanseatic League could starve entire principalities and bankrupt dukes by simply restricting the flow of salt, ensuring that their dried, brined fish never reached the markets of the hungry masses, unless their brutal economic terms were instantly and fully met. This chokehold was formalized through devastating trade laws, chief among them the terrifying Stapelrecht, the staple right, which was not a polite commercial suggestion. It was an iron ultimatum, a decree enforced by the combined cold naval strength of the League fleet. It meant that any and all goods traveling through a designated region, whether they originated 500 miles south in the trade centers of the Rhine or 1,000 miles east from the fur trappers of Novgorod, had to be unloaded, stored, inspected, and severely taxed within the heavily guarded walls of a designated Hanseatic city, most famously Lübeck, Hamburg, or Bremen.
To gain entry to a contour was to step outside the rule of man and into the domain of the Hanse, a monastic, brutal existence, where wealth was accumulated not in gold coins, but in the sheer tonnage of trade goods, furs, wax, timber, and the ocean's silver secret.
These outposts functioned as independent city-states of commerce, housing not just goods, but entire communities of meticulously vetted factors, scribes, and armed guards, all living under the draconian, self-imposed laws of the League.
They were the points of pressure the Hanse used to leverage royal courts, threatening to simply unplug the economic lifeline if taxes became too high or regulations too intrusive, a threat that terrified cash-strapped monarchs more than any invading army. Consider the contour at Bergen, Norway, the gateway to the Arctic wealth. It was called Bryggen, a collection of timber houses clinging precariously to the fjord, constantly smelling of fish and freezing spray. Here, the Hanse controlled the vital stockfish trade, dried cod from the unforgiving Lofoten Islands, a commodity so essential it fueled the Catholic fasts across the continent and formed the backbone of naval rations everywhere. The profits were astronomical, the risk equally lethal. These factors did not merely fear shipwreck, they feared robbery by savage highwaymen or arbitrary seizure by unpredictable Russian princes, demanding staggering bribes to maintain the flow of goods westward. To be verhanst meant you could not trade, you could not ship. Your debts were called in immediately, and every Hanse port slammed its gates shut, transforming the merchant into an outcast phantom, doomed to bankruptcy and ruin. This terror of internal exile, of being thrown out into the frigid, unprotected sea of competition, was the glue that held the decentralized empire together, a threat far more effective than any standing army or royal decree could ever be. They had unified the northern economy through sheer will, created a system of maritime law that superseded royal decrees, and locked down the food supply of a continent, establishing themselves as the shadow government of Northern Europe. But this immense, unchallenged power bred arrogance, and arrogance, even for the calculating, cold heart of the Hanseatic League, always carried the seed of its own destruction, a reckoning that was already sailing toward them on the unforgiving tides they thought they controlled absolutely.